going to be talking about some concepts from Chapter 1 of Maxfield and Babbie. Specifically, we're going to be discussing some of the purposes of research. So when we talk about the purposes of research, the first thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that there are four basic purposes: exploration, description, explanation, and evaluation or application. And basically, these four purposes exist in a hierarchy. So if we think about them in terms of the most basic to the most advanced, exploration is probably some of the more basic research. And then we move up to description, and then explanation, and then evaluation or application. So I'm just going to start from the beginning and just give you guys some examples of these research types in practice and what we would use them for. So exploration is done whenever we want to examine a specific problem, yet there's been no research done on this problem before. Okay, so we go into this in an exploratory mindset. We don't have any expectations about what we're going to find. We tend to use qualitative methods to understand a new phenomenon. So we might do interviews with people who are affected by it. We might actually go out and do observations, or we might collect documents about that phenomenon. Just to give you guys some practical examples, Dr. Moretto, who is on staff here at UCF and also my dissertation chair, for his dissertation, he was really interested in wildlife crime and wildlife law enforcement. And he was interested in knowing how the rangers in Uganda actually deal with poaching and how they basically just how they detect and prevent poaching and arrest poachers and that sort of thing. But there wasn't a lot of research on this topic. And so Dr. Moretto actually engaged in some exploratory research where he actually went to Uganda and lived with the rangers for, I think, a period of about 6 months. And he interviewed them, he went with them on patrol, and then when he came back, he wrote up his findings. And so a lot of what we know about wildlife law enforcement is because of his early study. But again, it was exploratory because no one had done anything on wildlife law enforcement up until that point. Another really great example of some exploratory research is John Van Monen's work. If you ever get a chance to read it, it's absolutely fascinating stuff. So Van Monen was a sociologist, and he was really interested in the police academy and understanding what goes on at the police academy. And so in the 1970s, he actually did some research where he joined the police academy himself. He went through the training, and he also interviewed officers and observed what they went through and then wrote up his experience. And so pretty much everything that we know about the police academy today is because of John Van Monen's early work. So we have him to thank for that. But again, it was exploratory because there wasn't any research that had been done on the police academy up until that point. So once we move beyond exploration, once we have a better handle on what something is, we can go a step up and we can go into the descriptive phase. And this is where we basically are now able to describe something using basic statistics, counting methods, documentation. We have some expectations about what basic trends we might see if we look at this topic. We have some surface knowledge of, but again, it's not real in depth because it's just one step up from the exploratory phase. Typically, descriptive research is associated with both qualitative methods and some quantitative methods. So again, our qualitative methods being interviews, observations, but now we might be able to incorporate some quantitative methods, so maybe some counting, maybe using agency records to keep track of things and deriving statistics from that. Some practical examples that we can talk about here, perceptions of use of force. So a lot of people were interested in knowing whether male and female officers differed in the amount of force that they used. And so there was some very influential research that was done in the 1970s and 1980s where observers actually watched the police and watched how they interacted with citizens and then would document incidents of use of force and then break those down by officer gender, officer race. And so we were able to get an understanding of who used force more frequently. Okay, but again, it was very descriptive research. Not a lot of research had been done on use of force at that point. There was some to kind of guide it, and we had some ideas and some theories about what to expect, and so that's why we moved up to the descriptive phase. Another example of descriptive research would be Conklin and Bittner's studies in the 1970s of residential burglary. So we didn't really know a whole lot about the dynamics behind residential burglary, but Conklin and Bittner collected data from a number of police agencies just on residential burglaries that they had investigated. And they basically looked at statistics in terms of days of the week that burglaries are most common, the most common method of entry, the most common things stolen, the dollar amounts of things stolen. And so they were able to come up with this descriptive kind of explanation of what goes on in residential burglary. So again, we kind of moved up in terms of our knowledge base to descriptive research. Okay, so the final two purposes of research are explanation and application. So with explanation, we're actually now able to describe some of the causal relationships, and we're able to make predictions. So we can ask, does A cause B? And we're able to make hypotheses about those relationships. Okay? So in other words, we have theory to guide us in many cases. Social learning theory is a good one and a good example for this. So social learning theory basically suggests that we learn to commit crimes from our peers, from our parents, from people that we interact with and that we hold in some high self-esteem or some high regard. And so a lot of the early research looked at juvenile delinquency. And what we found is that people that use drugs, like people that use marijuana, let's say, tended to have friends that also used marijuana. And this was a correlational relationship that was documented time and time and time again, that people who self-reported on surveys that they use marijuana, if we asked them, do you have friends that use marijuana, an overwhelming majority of them did. And so we saw this relationship again and again and again. And so this was kind of the basis of social learning theory, the idea that if you have friends that engage in delinquent behaviors, it's more likely that you are going to be able to engage in delinquent behaviors yourself, or that you're going to engage in those behaviors. And so we now have some theory to kind of guide us and explain behavior. Okay, so that's what makes this explanation or explanatory research. We also might even be able to do some experiments. Okay, there was a real interesting experiment done a number of years ago looking at foot patrols. So police foot patrols, and if we put police foot patrols in locations that have a lot of crime, what do you think happens? We see crime go down. Okay, the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment was one of the first that actually tested this. It was done, I think, back in the mid-2000s. These researchers identified locations in Philadelphia that had a high rate of violent crime, and they experimented with putting police officers in those locations. And what we found is that violent crime actually went down when the police were there. Makes sense. We have some theory to guide us, okay? And we have some assumption about those relationships and how they work. So that's what makes it explanatory or explanation research. Okay, and we tend to use quantitative methods with that. All right, in the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment, for instance, they used calls for service. So calls for police service. We looked at calls for police service and crime reporting prior to implementing foot patrols and then after, and we saw a reduction in crime reporting after those foot patrols were implemented. With some of the social learning research I talked about, surveys. So a lot of self-report surveys were used where we, interviewed juveniles and surveyed them about their drug use habits and then also the drug use habits of their friends. So again, quantitative research. The final step is application. And this is where we are actually applying criminal justice practice. We know enough about a topic, we know enough about theory that we can actually apply it in practice and use it to induce change and then document that change. A lot of times this is done in a single criminal justice agency, and we may be asked to evaluate a program and determine if, in fact, it's effective. I'll go ahead and pick on correctional folks for this example. There's a program called Thinking for Change that was developed for inmates in prison. And the whole idea about Thinking for Change is that it's a counseling program in which inmates are taught pro-social coping skills. Okay, and they're taught conflict resolution, conflict resolution, and basically just how to handle things in a pro-social manner. So the hope is that once they go through this program, once they have this Thinking for Change counseling, that when they're released from prison, that they'll know how to cope with problems in a pro-social way. And so hopefully they won't end up back in the system and kind of repeating some of the past behaviors that were problematic. And so researchers were asked to evaluate Thinking for Change. And so basically how that was done is they went into a single prison and we divided up the inmates. We have some of our inmates getting the Thinking for Change program, some of our inmates getting nothing, and then those inmates were tracked after they were released. And the hope was that the inmates that had been exposed to Thinking for Change would have better coping skills and would be less likely to get in trouble and less likely to end up back in prison. So we have a lot of offender reentry programs that look at those kind of factors and deal with those kind of factors. But it's application research because we've already gone through the exploration, descriptive, and explanation phases. Now we're actually able to apply theory and apply policy and document if it works. So that wraps it up for the purposes of research. I encourage you to read more about this in Maxfield and Babby because we only have time to go over some of the basics here. But again, 4 major purposes of research, okay? Exploration is the first phase. This is for new topics that we don't know a lot about, so we're going to use qualitative methods to get a better understanding. Descriptive research, this is where we have now some kind of surface knowledge of a topic, and we're going to use quantitative as well as qualitative methods to get a better understanding. There's explanation research, where now we can actually assert some causal relationships. Okay, so does A cause B? Does having peers that smoke marijuana means you'll do it yourself? Okay, does putting foot patrols in hot spots reduce crime? All right, and we can test that empirically. And then finally, application, where we're actually putting criminal justice theory and criminology theory and policy to work and actually testing it and seeing if it works in the real world. If you have any more questions about these concepts, please send me an email and I'd be happy to discuss them more. But that pretty much wraps it up for this virtual lecture. So I will see you guys online.